You really think he can hit anything with that? The laughter rolled across the rifle range before the old man ever touched the weapon. It was a bright Saturday morning at Fort Ridge, and the late summer sun hung high over the sprawling training grounds. Heat shimmered above the red dirt, turning distant targets into wavering silhouettes. Rows of recruits stood behind the firing line, their uniforms crisp, their confidence even sharper. They had spent the entire morning struggling with a qualification course that was supposed to be routine. The target sat hundreds of yards away across uneven terrain, steel silhouettes planted against a backdrop of dusty hills and scattered scrub oak. Every miss seemed to make the recruits more frustrated, and frustration had a way of searching for an easy target. Today, that target happened to be an 82-year-old man standing quietly near the edge of the range. Dean Callahan looked completely out of place. His faded green jacket had seen better decades. His jeans were worn at the knees. A weathered ball cap shaded pale blue eyes that seemed more interested in the movement of the wind than the activity on the firing line. While everyone else stared through optics or studied digital displays, Dean watched the range flags fluttering in different directions. He watched a hawk circle high above the hills. He watched the grass bend and straighten beneath invisible currents. To the recruits, it looked ridiculous. To them, he looked like somebody's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong place. Ethan Brooks, one of the loudest recruits in the platoon, smirked as he lifted his rifle from the rack. He was 20 years old, athletic, confident, and absolutely certain that experience had an expiration date. "Hey, old-timer," he called out. "You look interested. Want to give it a shot?" Several recruits laughed immediately. A few pulled out their phones. Others exchanged grins, sensing entertainment. Dean turned slowly toward the voice. His expression didn't change. He simply looked at Ethan with calm eyes that seemed untouched by the mockery surrounding him. That calmness irritated Ethan more than any argument could have. "Come on," Ethan said. "We could use a laugh." The group chuckled again. One recruit suggested they make a bet. Another predicted the old man wouldn't even be able to shoulder the rifle properly. The jokes spread quickly through the line. Dean listened without reacting. He had heard worse things in his lifetime. He had heard louder voices. He had heard people speak with certainty before discovering how little they actually knew. The range instructor was busy reviewing scores with another squad and paid little attention to the growing crowd. The recruits sensed freedom in that moment. The teasing grew bolder. "Maybe we should move the target closer," someone called. "Maybe 50 feet. More laughter followed. Ethan stepped forward and extended the rifle with an exaggerated grin. "Here," he said. "Let's see what you've got." For a moment, the range seemed to grow strangely quiet. The wind shifted. The nearest flag snapped once against its pole. Dean looked at the rifle, then beyond it toward the distant hills. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not because of the challenge, not because of the recruits, but because something about the rifle felt familiar, and somewhere deep behind those calm blue eyes, an old memory was beginning to stir. Dean reached out and accepted the rifle without a trace of hesitation. The laughter around him continued for another few seconds before gradually fading into scattered murmurs. Up close, the weapon looked nearly new. The metal carried the clean scent of fresh oil. The stock showed only the faint marks that came from regular training use. Ethan folded his arms and leaned back with the confidence of someone already certain of the outcome. Around him, the recruits shifted into a loose semicircle, eager to watch what they expected would become an embarrassing spectacle. Dean did not shoulder the rifle immediately. Instead, he held it carefully in both hands and studied it. His weathered fingers traced along the stock. He checked the sights. He examined the sling attachment points. Every movement was slow and deliberate. The recruits exchanged amused glances. To them, it looked as though he was stalling. The morning sun reflected off the distant steel targets, turning them into tiny flashes against the hills. One of the recruits laughed and checked the distance marker. The target sat nearly 800 yards away, farther than most of them had successfully engaged all day. Ethan pointed toward the hills. "That one," he said. "If you are going to try, that is the target." Dean followed the direction of his finger, but did not answer. A light breeze moved across the range. Dust drifted along the ground in thin ribbons. The nearest flag pointed one direction, while a second flag farther downrange pointed another. Dean noticed both. He also noticed the shimmer of heat rising from the rocky terrain between the firing line and the target. Most people never looked at such things. Most people trusted screens. Dean trusted what he could see. The crowd continued growing. Even recruits from neighboring lanes had begun wandering over. A few expected a joke. Others simply wanted a distraction from a frustrating training day. Near the back of the gathering stood Lance Corporal Ryan Mercer. Unlike the others, he was not smiling. Something about the old man felt familiar, though he could not explain why. Ryan watched Dean's eyes move across the landscape. He watched the way Dean stood, relaxed but somehow completely focused. It reminded him of stories he had heard from older instructors, stories about marksmen who could read a range the way sailors read the ocean. Dean finally raised the rifle and settled it lightly against his shoulder. The movement was smooth, effortless, not the motion of someone handling an unfamiliar object, but of someone greeting an old friend. Ryan felt a strange chill despite the heat. Ethan noticed it too, though he quickly dismissed the feeling. "Take your time," he called out with a grin. "We are all enjoying the show." More laughter followed, but it sounded weaker now. Dean ignored every word. His attention remained fixed on the distant target. The breeze shifted again. A hawk drifted across the sky above the hills. Dean's eyes followed it briefly before returning to the range. Then his thumb brushed against a small worn mark near the stock, and for the first time, something changed in his expression. It was subtle, barely visible, yet Ryan saw it immediately. The old man was no longer looking at a training range. Somewhere behind those pale blue eyes, an entirely different memory had begun to awaken. The laughter faded almost completely as Dean continued staring at the small worn mark near the stock. To everyone else, it looked insignificant. Just another scratch among dozens left behind by years of handling and transport. But Dean's thumb lingered there for a moment longer than necessary. The afternoon heat seemed to soften around him. The chatter of recruits drifted into the distance. For an instant, he was somewhere else entirely. Not because of the rifle itself, but because certain objects carried memories the way old wood carried the scent of rain. The wind brushed across the range again. Dean blinked once and returned to the present. The steel target remained a tiny shape against the distant hillside. Ethan shifted impatiently. He had expected the old man either to refuse or make a fool of himself by now. Instead, Dean simply stood there with an unsettling calm that made the young recruit increasingly uncomfortable. "You planning to shoot today?" Ethan asked. A few recruits chuckled, though the sound lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Dean glanced toward the nearest range flag. "The wind is changing," he said quietly. Ethan smirked. "That is why we have equipment." He pointed toward a spotting station where digital screens displayed environmental data. "Everything is right there." Dean looked at the screens. Then he looked back at the hills. Not everything. Several recruits exchanged confused looks. Ethan rolled his eyes. "The computers account for wind speed." "At this position," Dean replied. "Not halfway there. Not near the ridge. Not where the ground drops before the target." The answer came so naturally that it caught a few listeners off guard. Ethan quickly laughed it off. "Sure. And let me guess. You can see all that with your eyes." Dean did not answer. His silence felt heavier than an argument. Ryan Mercer found himself studying the old veteran more carefully. The explanation should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it sounded oddly specific. Ryan looked through a spotting scope toward the distant terrain. Heat shimmer danced above the rocks. The target stood beyond a shallow depression hidden from the firing line. For the first time all morning, Ryan noticed how uneven the landscape truly was. Dean slowly lowered the rifle and looked toward the sky. A hawk drifted across the valley, barely moving its wings. The bird seemed to glide effortlessly through invisible currents. Dean watched it for several seconds before nodding almost to himself. Ryan felt another chill. The old man was reading things nobody else appeared to notice. Around them, recruits continued gathering. Even a few instructors had started paying attention. What began as entertainment was slowly becoming curiosity. Dean adjusted his grip on the rifle. The motion was smooth and practiced. Not flashy, not dramatic, simply familiar. One instructor standing near the equipment shed narrowed his eyes. Something about the way the veteran handled the rifle caught his attention. It was difficult to explain. There were no wasted movements. No uncertainty. Every action flowed naturally into the next. Ethan noticed the growing audience and grinned. He believed the crowd was gathering to witness a failure. Dean seemed unaware of any of it. His attention remained fixed on the range itself. The wind shifted once more. Dust lifted from the ground and drifted across the firing line. Dean watched its path carefully. Then he took a slow breath. Ryan could not explain why, but a feeling settled into the pit of his stomach. Whatever happened next, it was not going to unfold the way Ethan Brooks expected. Dean settled the rifle against his shoulder once more, but before he aligned the sights, his thumb brushed across the worn mark near the stock again. This time the memory came into focus with startling clarity. The bright heat of Fort Ridge faded beneath the weight of another summer long ago. He could almost smell damp pine carried on a distant breeze. He could hear the soft rustle of leaves moving across a ridgeline. He was 19 again, standing on a remote training range surrounded by young men who believed they had endless time ahead of them. The rifle in his hands had been different, older, heavier, marked by use rather than age. Yet the small scar near the stock had looked almost identical. It had appeared after a rough field exercise when the rifle slipped against a rocky outcrop during a sudden storm. Most people would never have noticed the mark. Dean remembered it because he had carried that rifle through every qualification afterward. The scratch became a landmark beneath his fingertips, something familiar when everything else changed. The memory lingered only for a few seconds before the present returned. The distant hills of Fort Ridge sharpened into view once again. The recruits stood waiting. The wind continued its invisible dance across the valley. Dean's expression remained calm, but Ryan Mercer noticed something different. The old veteran no longer seemed like a curious visitor. He looked like a man standing exactly where he belonged. Near the equipment shed, Master Sergeant Walter Briggs stepped out of the shade and narrowed his eyes. Briggs had spent nearly 3 decades around ranges, competitions, and marksmanship programs. Experience had taught him that genuine skill often revealed itself before a single shot was taken. It appeared in posture, breathing, focus, the way a person carried a rifle. Briggs watched Dean carefully and felt a flicker of recognition he could not yet explain. Ethan remained oblivious. He grinned at the growing audience and seemed pleased with the attention. "Everybody getting a good view?" he called. A few recruits laughed. Others remained silent. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. The jokes no longer landed the way they had 10 minutes earlier. Dean slowly adjusted his stance. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to settle naturally into position. Briggs frowned. It was an old technique, one he had not seen in years. Ryan noticed it too. The movement looked efficient, almost effortless, as though it had been practiced thousands of times. The veteran took a slow breath and released it. The range seemed quieter than before. Even the recruits who had been recording with their phones lowered them slightly. A strange anticipation spread through the crowd. Nobody could explain why. Dean's eyes remained fixed on the distant terrain rather than the target itself. He studied the shimmering air above the rocks. He watched the grass bend near a shallow depression halfway downrange. He watched the nearest flag flutter left while another farther away drifted right. Then he gave the smallest nod. Ryan saw it clearly. The old man had found something. Not on a screen. Not through software. Out there in the landscape itself. And for the first time all afternoon, Ryan Mercer began to wonder if everyone standing on that firing line had misunderstood exactly who Dean Callahan really was. Ryan could not take his eyes off the old veteran. Around him, the range remained suspended in a strange silence. Nobody seemed eager to joke anymore. Even Ethan Brooks had stopped talking. The confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with curiosity. Dean stood motionless with the rifle resting comfortably against his shoulder. The worn mark near the stock remained beneath his thumb, and with it came another wave of memory. This one was clearer than before. The distant hills of Fort Ridge dissolved into a landscape from another lifetime. The air felt cooler. Pine trees covered the slopes. Morning fog drifted across a valley as sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds. Dean was 19 years old again, standing beside a line of young servicemen during an advanced marksmanship course tucked deep in the mountains. Back then, nobody knew his name. Nobody expected much from him. He was quiet, reserved, and easy to overlook. The instructors focused on louder personalities, the men who seemed born to lead. Dean preferred to listen. He watched the wind. He watched shadows move across terrain. He watched birds alter their flight paths when air currents shifted. While others focused only on targets, Dean studied everything between himself and the target. One instructor noticed. Master Sergeant Frank Wheeler, a veteran marksman with silver beginning to creep into his dark hair. Wheeler rarely praised anyone, but he paid attention to details. One morning, after watching Dean consistently place accurate shots despite difficult conditions, Wheeler walked over and handed him a training rifle. "Tell me what the wind is doing," he said. Dean looked across the valley. He studied the trees, the fog, and the grass moving along the ridgeline. Then he described 3 separate currents moving through different sections of the landscape. Wheeler stared at him for several seconds before smiling. "Most people see distance," the instructor said. "You see the path." That sentence stayed with Dean for the rest of his life. Years later, he still remembered exactly how the mountain air smelled that morning. He remembered the sunlight breaking through the fog. He remembered the worn scratch on the rifle stock after it scraped against stone during a field exercise. The same scratch his thumb traced now through memory. Back at Fort Ridge, the present returned slowly. Heat shimmer replaced mountain fog. Dust replaced pine scent. Yet the lesson remained unchanged. Dean looked beyond the target once more. He was not measuring distance. He was studying the path. Ryan Mercer watched carefully as the veteran's eyes moved across the terrain. Suddenly something clicked in his mind. The old man was doing exactly what the legends described. Not relying on equipment. Not relying on calculations displayed on a screen. Reading the entire environment. Ryan felt a knot form in his stomach. Nearby, Master Sergeant Briggs continued observing from the edge of the crowd. His expression had grown increasingly serious. He had seen talented shooters before. He had seen competitors, instructors, champions. Yet there was something different about Dean. Something older. Something that belonged to another era. The breeze shifted once again across the range. Dean noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then, for the first time since accepting the rifle, he settled completely into position. The movement was so natural it barely seemed intentional. Ryan swallowed hard. Deep down, he realized he was no longer waiting to see whether the old veteran would succeed. He was beginning to wonder how many people standing on that firing line were about to witness something they would never forget. The range held its breath. Dean remained motionless behind the rifle while the afternoon sun painted long waves of heat across the valley. The distant steel target appeared almost unreal now, shimmering against the rocky hillside nearly 800 yards away. Around him, dozens of eyes remained fixed on the old veteran. Nobody laughed anymore. Even Ethan Brooks stood silent with his arms folded, trying to hide the uncertainty creeping into his expression. Dean adjusted the rifle by less than an inch. The movement was so slight most people never noticed it. Ryan Mercer did. So did Master Sergeant Briggs. Both men exchanged a brief glance. They had spent enough time around skilled shooters to recognize discipline when they saw it. Dean was not rushing. He was waiting. The wind brushed across the range once more. A small cloud of dust drifted through the low ground halfway to the target before fading into the sunlight. Dean watched it carefully. His eyes moved from the dust to the grass near the ridgeline, and then to the distant flag standing beyond the target. 3 different indicators. 3 different stories. Yet somehow they formed a single picture in his mind. Ethan finally broke the silence. "What are you waiting for?" he called. Dean did not look away from the range. "The last piece," he answered quietly. Several recruits frowned. The response made little sense to them. Ryan, however, found himself studying the terrain again. A few seconds later he noticed it. A faint shift in the mirage rising above the rocks near the center of the valley. The wavering heat suddenly flowed in a different direction. Dean saw it too. A calm expression settled across his face. Whatever he had been waiting for had finally arrived. Master Sergeant Briggs felt his pulse quicken. He had watched competitive marksmen spend entire careers learning to interpret conditions like these. Yet this old veteran seemed to process them instinctively. Dean took a slow breath. The rifle became perfectly still. Not rigid. Not forced. Simply steady. The kind of steadiness that came only from thousands of repetitions spread across decades. The crowd seemed frozen around him. A distant vehicle moved somewhere beyond the range. A flag snapped softly in the breeze. Then even those sounds faded from attention. Ryan realized he was gripping the edge of the spotting bench. Ethan no longer looked amused. He looked invested. Nobody wanted to admit it, but every person standing there wanted to know the same thing. Could the old man actually do it? Dean released part of his breath and remained motionless. Seconds passed. The valley stretched endlessly before him. Then a single sharp report cracked across the range. The rifle barely seemed to move. The sound rolled away into the hills and disappeared. Everyone immediately looked toward the target. Nothing happened. The steel silhouette remained standing. Ethan let out a short laugh of relief. Several recruits began smiling again. "Missed," somebody muttered. But Ryan never lowered his spotting scope. Neither did Briggs. Both men continued staring at the distant target. 1 second passed, then another, then a third, and suddenly Ryan felt his stomach drop as he noticed something nobody else had seen yet. The target was no longer standing quite the same way it had before. Ryan lowered the spotting scope for only a second before immediately bringing it back to his eye. Something was wrong, or perhaps something was finally right. The steel silhouette in the distance no longer stood at the same angle. At first, the change was almost impossible to notice. Then the afternoon sunlight shifted across the hillside and revealed it clearly. The target had tilted backward. A quiet gasp escaped Ryan before he could stop himself. "Hold on," he said. Nobody listened. Most of the recruits were already beginning to relax. A few smiled. Ethan Brooks looked relieved. The outcome appeared obvious to them. The target remained upright. The old veteran had taken his shot. Nothing dramatic had happened. Case closed. Then Ryan spoke again, louder this time. "Wait." The single word cut through the chatter. Several heads turned toward him. Ryan kept the spotting scope pressed against his face. His pulse quickened. The steel silhouette was not merely leaning. The entire mounting assembly behind it appeared displaced, as though tremendous precision had transferred force through a point nobody expected. Master Sergeant Briggs stepped forward immediately. Without saying a word, he reached for another spotting scope positioned near the instructor station. The older non-commissioned officer adjusted the focus and stared toward the distant hillside. 3 seconds passed. Then 4. His expression changed completely. The confidence vanished from Ethan's face the moment he saw Briggs lower the scope. "What is it?" one recruit asked. Briggs did not answer immediately. He looked from the target back to Dean Callahan. The veteran stood exactly where he had been standing moments earlier. Calm, relaxed, uninterested in the growing tension surrounding him. It was as though he already knew the result. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He had seen excellent shots before. He had seen lucky shots. This felt like neither. Briggs finally spoke. "Get a range vehicle out there." Silence followed. One instructor blinked. "Sir, now." The order carried enough weight to erase any hesitation. A utility vehicle started moments later and began moving across the valley floor toward the target line. Dust trailed behind its tires. Every eye followed its progress. What had started as a joke was becoming something else entirely. Ethan folded his arms tighter. He tried to maintain his composure, but uncertainty had taken hold. "It was one shot," he said quietly. Nobody responded. Dean handed the rifle back without ceremony. He treated the entire event as though it were finished. Ryan watched him carefully. The old veteran displayed no excitement, no pride, no expectation of praise. He simply adjusted his jacket and looked out across the range once more. The breeze moved through the grass. The flags continued fluttering. Dean seemed far more interested in those things than the crowd gathering around him. Minutes later, the utility vehicle reached the target position. The driver stepped out. Another instructor followed. Both men disappeared behind the steel silhouette. From nearly 800 yards away, their movements were difficult to read. Then one of them suddenly froze. Even at that distance, the reaction was obvious. He called the second instructor over. A moment later, both men turned toward the firing line. Neither moved for several seconds. Ryan felt a chill run through him. Whatever they had discovered, it was far beyond what anyone standing at Fort Ridge had expected. The utility vehicle bounced across the uneven ground and finally came to a stop beside the target line. From the firing range, everyone watched in silence. The two instructors stepped around the steel silhouette, examining something hidden from view. One of them crouched down. The other removed his cap and stared for several seconds before reaching for a radio. Back at the firing line, the tension became almost unbearable. Ethan Brooks shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The confidence that had fueled his jokes all afternoon was disappearing rapidly. Around him, the recruits remained unusually quiet. Nobody seemed willing to guess what had happened. Master Sergeant Briggs stood with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the distant scene. Then the radio on his belt crackled to life. The voice that came through sounded stunned. "Master Sergeant, you need to hear this." Briggs reached for the radio immediately. "Go ahead." There was a brief pause. Even through the static, the disbelief was obvious. The impact hit exactly at the mounting connection. The target is still standing, but the support assembly behind it shifted completely out of alignment. "I have never seen anything like this." Several instructors exchanged looks. Ethan felt his stomach sink. Briggs remained silent for a moment before asking a simple question. "Distance confirmed?" 793 yards. Another pause followed. "And the conditions?" The reply came almost instantly. "Crosswinds across multiple sections of the valley. We checked twice." Briggs slowly lowered the radio. His gaze drifted toward Dean Callahan. The old veteran stood alone near the firing line, calm as ever. Ryan Mercer noticed the expression on the Master Sergeant's face. It was not surprise anymore. It was recognition. Nearby, one of the range administrators hurried toward the operations building carrying a tablet. Ryan watched him disappear through the door. A few minutes later, another instructor emerged and headed directly toward the administrative office. Then another. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something bigger than a single shot. Ethan noticed it too. "Why is everybody acting like this?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Ryan stepped toward the operations building and glanced through the open doorway. Inside, 2 staff members were searching through old personnel records. Names appeared on screens. Files opened and closed. One of the administrators suddenly stopped typing. "No way," he whispered. Ryan could not see the monitor, but he saw the man's reaction. The administrator picked up a phone immediately. Not a routine call. A direct line. His posture changed the moment someone answered. Across the range, Dean seemed completely unaware of the growing chain reaction. He looked toward the hills where the afternoon sunlight painted long shadows across the terrain. The same hills he had studied before taking the shot. The same wind he had read without a computer. Ryan found himself wondering how many stories remained hidden behind those calm blue eyes. Then another vehicle appeared at the far end of the base road. Unlike the utility cart, this one moved with purpose. It headed directly toward the range. Master Sergeant Briggs saw it first. His expression tightened. Whatever information had been uncovered inside the operations building had already reached someone important. Very important. The vehicle rolled onto the range and came to a stop in a cloud of dust. Conversations died instantly. Even the wind seemed quieter. The driver's door opened, and Colonel Jack Donovan stepped out. The effect was immediate. Instructors straightened. Recruits exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had expected a senior officer to appear because of a single afternoon training exercise. Yet Donovan was already striding across the firing line with purpose. He did not stop to ask for reports. He did not walk toward the instructors. His eyes were fixed on only one person. Dean Callahan. Ryan Mercer felt his pulse quicken. Ethan Brooks stared in disbelief. The colonel crossed the distance between them and came to a halt directly in front of the old veteran. For a moment, neither man spoke. The sunlight reflected off the colonel's insignia, while dust drifted lazily through the warm afternoon air. Then, to the complete shock of everyone present, Colonel Donovan came to attention. The movement was sharp, precise, respectful. Silence swept across the range. Ethan felt his mouth go dry. Ryan could barely believe what he was seeing. Dean looked at the colonel and offered the faintest smile. It was the smile of someone greeting an old memory rather than an important officer. "It has been a long time, sir," Donovan said quietly. Dean nodded. "Long enough." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire range seemed frozen in place. Donovan glanced toward the distant target and then back at the veteran. "The records office found your file," he said. "Not all of it. Just enough." Several recruits exchanged confused looks. Ethan felt his stomach sink further. Donovan turned slightly, addressing the crowd without taking his eyes completely off Dean. "The man standing in front of you spent years teaching advanced field marksmanship before most of us ever put on a uniform. Techniques still taught today trace back to programs he helped build. The lessons, the methods, the way you read terrain. Many of them began with people like him." The words settled heavily over the range. Ryan suddenly understood why everything had felt familiar. Dean had never been guessing. He had simply been applying knowledge earned across a lifetime. Donovan looked at the veteran again. "They told me what happened out there." Dean shrugged lightly. Just one shot. The colonel smiled. That is exactly what they all said. A few instructors laughed softly. The tension finally began to ease. Ethan lowered his eyes. The embarrassment he felt was impossible to hide now. He remembered every joke, every smirk, every careless comment. Dean noticed. He could have said something. He could have reminded the recruits how wrong they had been. Instead, he simply picked up his cap and adjusted it against the afternoon sun. They are young, he said. That is how learning starts. Ethan looked up in surprise. There was no anger in the old veteran's voice. No bitterness. Only quiet understanding. The wind moved across the valley one final time, bending the grass and fluttering the range flags. For several seconds nobody spoke. The recruits stood silently. The instructors stood silently. Even Colonel Donovan remained silent. It was not the silence of embarrassment anymore. It was respect, the kind that cannot be demanded and cannot be taught through lectures. It can only be earned. And as Dean Callahan turned toward the hills and began walking away, every person on that firing line understood they had witnessed far more than an extraordinary shot. They had witnessed the difference between confidence and mastery, and they would remember it long after the dust settled across Fort Ridge.